Imagine this, a vast dominion stretching across the top of the world. Cities with improbable architecture, towers, domes, star-shaped fortresses that seem to follow a language we no longer speak. And then silence. Not the slow fading of an empire conquered in battle, not the gentle erosion of time wearing down stone, but something harsher. A vanishing. A name that once covered enormous territories on maps, scrubbed away as if it had become inconvenient. Tartaria. For centuries, European cartographers, French, Dutch, German, Italian, inked that word across the heart of northern Asia. From the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, over Siberia, Central Asia, and beyond. Sometimes Great Tartary, sometimes Independent Tartary, Chinese, Tartary, Russian Tartary. They were not fringe doodles. These were official atlases made by competing nations drawing lines in an age when maps were power. If Tartaria were only a vague label for people we don't know why, the subdivisions, why the repeated insistence on internal regions, multiple Tartaries under one umbrella. And if it were only that a fuzzy term for nomads, why by the 19th century does it vanish so cleanly? Modern textbooks, when they mention the word at all, tend to wave it away. An old name for steppe, lands inhabited by Tatar horse peoples of Turkic and Mongol descent. A cartographic shrug. But the more obsessive you are with patterns, the more that shrug feels thin. If it was just a placeholder, why the precise boundaries drawn again and again? Why the sudden nearly uniform disappearance across atlases, as if some quiet agreement had been reached? This label no longer exists. Theories gather in that blank space. One says nothing more sinister than progress, as Russian power expanded eastward, as borders solidified, the old word outlived its usefulness. Another whispers something else, that as those lands were absorbed, their older identity, whatever it truly was, had to be folded into the new order and forgotten. Folded or buried. Because when people talk about Tartaria now, they rarely stop at maps. At the center of this modern legend sits another idea, the mud flood. Not a biblical wall of water, not a slow process of urban raising for sanitation. A sudden liquefaction. Cities swallowed in earth that briefly behaved like water. Whole ground floors disappearing overnight beneath a moving thick slurry that hardened into a new level. Imagine a city alive on Monday, its streets lined with shop fronts and windows. By Friday, those same windows half underground doors leading nowhere, pavements now at what used to be second floor height. Life shifted upwards, the buried layer left as basement cellars forgotten. To believers, this was not local. It was global. A reset. History rewritten, not just by changing words on maps, but by physically covering over a previous world. Look down, they say. Not up. Down at cities where what should be first floors are half subterranean. Down at ornate stonework, now staring out from beneath street level, as if the modern sidewalk had been dropped across an older facade. If you have ever walked through an underground city tour in Seattle, or looked at photographs of buried arches in New York excavations, or seen European buildings where windows open directly onto dirt, you may already have felt the oddness, even if you never named it. Official explanations talk about regrading raised streets, fires, floods, pragmatic improvements. The mud flood narrative says, what if those explanations are not the first story, but the cover story? What if something happened in the 1800s that demanded not just rebuilding, but forgetting? For 300 years, Tartaria was there, in ink. From the 16th to the early 19th century, atlases across Europe showed it as a massive presence. Independent cartographers working in rival nations borrowed from each other, yes, but also revised, corrected, disagreed on many things. And yet on Tartaria, they converged. Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, not a single tribe, not a single khanate. A spread of lands under one conceptual roof. Then, as imperial projects matured, the word thins out. Siberia grows. Named Russian governorates appear. Central Asian khanates are folded into Turkestan, Russian Empire, Qing China. By the late 1800s, Tartaria is mostly gone from mainstream maps. If you take a charitable view, this is simply precision replacing vagueness. Better surveying, clearer borders, a term retired. If you take a more suspicious view, it looks like rebranding. Powerful empires, Russia, Qing China, expanding European states absorb territories once grouped under that label. Their own names take precedence. Whatever older identity those lands once carried is overwritten. The idea that this overwriting might not have been only political but civilizational is where the conspiracy takes shape. Because the maps line up with another pattern-buried architecture. In Seattle, the famous underground shows entire blocks of 19th century storefronts now below street level. Original ground floors turned basements. Windows staring out at concrete and darkness. Sidewalks up where second-floor windows once were. The mainstream story is neat, devastating fire. In 1889, frequent flooding, bad plumbing. The city decides to raise street levels for better drainage. Streets are built atop retaining walls. Old first floors become underground. To mud flood theorists, that neatness is precisely the problem. Why, they ask, is the depth of burial so eerily uniform? Why do the lowest, most ornate parts of certain buildings look older, finer, and sometimes more weathered than what sits on top of them? If these were all thrown up quickly by pioneer builders in a rough logging town who carved the intricate stonework now hidden below, the pattern they claim repeats. New York. During subway excavations, vaulted ceilings and detailed masonry appear far below current ground level, suggesting earlier layers of construction that do not fit the official timeline. Chicago, after its Great Fire in 1871, raises streets. Yet beneath, there are hints of structures that look less like makeshift frontier architecture and more like something systematically designed. Cross the Atlantic. In European cities, Paris, London, Edinburgh, there are houses where what appears to be the basement has framed windows and decorative details as if it once faced open air. Whole underground vaults and streets repurposed as cellars or tourist attractions. The conventional explanation is gradual cities regrade. Rivers are contained. Sewage systems are installed. Over centuries, street levels rise. The mud flood lens looks at the same evidence and sees a single moment. A deluge of liquefied ground, a tide of earth sweeping through streets, filling lower levels, leaving upper stories as the new ground floor. Afterwards, life climbs onto this hardened layer, cleans up what can be salvaged, and builds on top, leaving a fossil of another time entombed below. From this perspective, the erasure of Tartaria from maps and the sudden entombment of ornate lower levels in cities across continents are not separate stories. They are two faces of one reset. When people talk about Tartaria and the mud flood, another name drifts into the conversation: Graham Hancock. In his series, Ancient Apocalypse, Hancock walks through landscapes scarred by older cataclysms. He looks at boulder fields, eroded terraces, submerged ruins. He argues that we may be survivors of an Ice Age civilization erased by violent floods around 12,000 years ago. He stands at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where T-shaped pillars carved with animals rise from the ground, and asks how hunter-gatherers could have achieved such complexity without inherited knowledge. He points to the younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap at the end of the Ice Age, and to signs of comet impacts that might have melted ice sheets, sent walls of water across continents, and forced a civilizational reset. In episodes like Once There Was a Flood, he traces geological scars, channels gouged by meltwater, giant erratic boulders dropped where no glacier now exists. He walks in the Amazon and finds hints of older human shaping beneath the forest. He shows ancient maps like the Piri Reis chart with coastlines of Antarctica drawn as if ice-free centuries before our official first view. Mainstream archaeology pushes back hard. Hancock is called a pseudo-historian, accused of cherry-picking of dating things loosely and ignoring inconvenient data. Professional societies issue statements warning viewers against mistaking his narratives for consensus. Yet the resonance is not so easily dismissed, because the emotional core of his work is the same as the emotional core of the Tartaria story. What if our timeline is wrong? What if what we call progress is not a clean ascent, but a climb back from repeated falls? The mud flood is in that sense a more recent echo of Hancock's older flood, a 19th century version of a much older pattern liquefaction deluge erasure. In this frame, Tartaria is not an isolated anomaly. It is one step in a long series of forgotten peaks, a descendant perhaps of that Ice Age civilization, an inheritor of older knowledge about energy geometry resonance. And the mud flood becomes not an isolated landslide, but a deliberate, or at least harnessed, event. A tool in a grand reset to bury evidence that we are not in fact the first to stand at this technological threshold. Supporters string the threads together. Ancient maps showing strange accuracy, buried buildings with ornate facades below ground, world's fairs rising suddenly dazzling, then demolished, forgotten patents for unusual machines, suppressed theories about free energy. Each piece on its own can be explained away. Together in the quiet hours of the night, they can feel like a pattern. And once you feel that pattern, other anomalies start to glow. Oversized doors, strange acoustics, stories of giants. Have you ever stood in front of an old building and felt physically that it was not quite built for you? A doorway 15 feet high, a staircase with steps so deep and tall they demand an awkward stretch, windows towering far above eye level, rooms whose scale leaves ordinary human bodies feeling like miniatures in a set. In state capitals, opera houses, grand banks, and palaces, especially those built, or said to be built, in the 19th century, this sensation can be strong. The Iowa State Capitol, with its gilded domes and dense ornamentation. Palaces in St. Petersburg, ornate halls in San Francisco, some rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake. Ceilings 3 times higher than necessity. Furniture in old photographs with seats and tabletops oddly elevated. To the Tartaria imagination, these are not just stylistic choices, they are clues, relics of a time when the primary inhabitants were not our size. Giants. 19th century newspapers, especially in America, are full of strange reports. miners uncovering skeletons 7, 8, 9 feet tall, excavations in mounds revealing oversized skulls, massive femurs, stories of red-haired giants in caves of strange burial sites with tools too large for ordinary use. Often, these stories end the same way the bones sent to museums to the Smithsonian, then quietly lost. Across cultures, myth keeps circling similar figures. Greek titans, biblical Nephilim giants born of sons of God, and human women roaming the earth before a great flood. Norse tales of enormous warriors, Native American oral histories of encounters with towering, often hostile beings dwelling in mounds. Separate cultures, separate continents. Yet similar motifs, large beings advanced in some ways, entangled with a cataclysm. For some, that repetition is nothing more than the human tendency to personify forces of nature in oversized forms. For others, it is cultural memory of something real, a physically larger strain of humanity, perhaps connected to Tartaria's builders. The architecture seems to cooperate with this idea. The columns rise like petrified trees. The doors yawn. The steps stretch. Armor preserved in places like the Hermitage Museum, dismissed as ceremonial looks through this lens, like something that might have fit a 9-foot soldier rather than a 5'8" guardsman. Beyond size, there is another layer sound. Step inside certain cathedrals, capitals, or concert halls, and your voice behaves strangely. Whispers carry. A single note sung at a particular spot vibrates in your bones. Echoes stack on each other in precise harmonies. Cymatics, the study of how vibration shapes matter, shows how sound can form definite patterns in sand water, even flame. Modern labs use ultrasonic waves to levitate tiny objects. Infrasound can alter mood, induce unease, or euphoria. If Tartaria, and perhaps these imagined giants, understood and used these principles at scale, then their buildings were not just big. They were instruments, resonance chambers, places where certain frequencies could be amplified, focused perhaps even used to manipulate heavy stones, influence health, or alter consciousness. In that picture, doorways and ceilings are not only about the dimensions of bodies. They are part of a larger geometry, one that could tie into other recurring shapes, star forts. Star forts, those strange snowflake-like bastions that appear again and again on old plans and satellite images. Angular multi-pointed outlines radiating from a center, moats tracing the same geometry. From Europe to North America, from India to distant corners of the world, these designs repeat. The standard explanation is military. In the age of cannon, circular walls were vulnerable. By projecting bastions outward in a star pattern, defenders could cover each other's blind spots, create overlapping fields of fire, and turn any attacker into a target. Engineers like Vauban perfected these forms in early modern Europe. Textbooks describe them as clever, but ultimately mundane. The Tartarian narrative looks at the same forms and sees multi-purpose structures. Energy devices, not just fortifications. The proportions measured carefully often align with simple ratios found in music and mathematics. Angles repeat in ways that coincide with resonant patterns. Some star forts sit directly on known geological anomalies, geomagnetic hotspots, intersections of what some call ley lines. Modern visitors with electromagnetic field meters sometimes record spikes during solar storms or at particular points in these forts. Acoustic tests reveal odd standing waves in their interiors. From that vantage point, the star fort is less like a fortress and more like an antenna, or a tuning fork. A piece of architecture designed to interact with the planet's own fields. Link that to the cathedrals whose domes and vaults produce uncanny acoustics, to palaces whose layouts mirror sacred geometry, to reports, however anecdotal, of people feeling physically altered in these spaces. And then fold in one more ingredient, the sky. Airships. Photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s show ungainly dirigibles, zeppelins, early blimps drifting over cities. Official history calls them primitive, dangerous. Limited experiments before airplanes took over. But strip away the disasters, and some accounts describe something else. Craft that hovered silently, stayed aloft with eerie stability, crossed long distances with ease. Sketches show mooring masts on tall buildings docking like boats at piers. In the Tartaria story, these are not awkward first steps, but echoes. Remnants of a previous age when airships powered not by explosive gas alone, but by interactions with the atmosphere's own electrical field, moved gracefully between starfort ports that doubled as energy nodes. By this point, the line between careful speculation and unmoored imagination is thin. Skeptics stand firmly on one side. Grand doors decorative, giant armor, ceremonial or mismeasured, skeletons, hoaxes, or misidentified animals. Resonance, an aesthetic side effect. Star forts, clever but conventional defense. Believers stand on the other. Uniform patterns across continents. Stories of giants across cultures. Weird acoustics. Odd electromagnetism. Too much to be coincidence. Somewhere between them, sleepless minds drift, drawn less by proof than by the texture of the questions. Because even if every literal claim about Tartarian giants and energy forts were wrong, the feeling they tap into is very real, that we live among structures whose full purpose we no longer understand. Now picture yourself in the sky. Not in a pressurized tube roaring at hundreds of miles per hour, but in a slower vessel gliding over a sleeping city. Below domes gleam softly. Star-shaped ramparts trace faint outlines in the moonlight. At the edge of town, a tower rises, a spire designed not for flags, but for docking. The airship's hull hums with a subtle vibration. No roar, no propeller chopping. Energy seems to flow through it rather than be burned inside it. This is how Tartarian technology is imagined. Not noisy, not dirty, not chained to coal oil or fission. Built instead on resonance, on crystals, on the same principles that may be encoded in those star forts and cathedrals. Free energy, a phrase that by itself is enough to trigger skepticism. It clashes with thermodynamics as currently understood. It has been used to peddle scams. And yet the story persists. Nikola Tesla, the enigmatic inventor at the turn of the 20th century, dreamed of broadcasting energy wirelessly across the globe. His Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, unfinished and ultimately demolished, was designed to tap into the Earth's electrical potential, using resonance to move power through the air rather than through wires. Officially, Tesla ran out of funding. Backers withdrew. His system was impractical. Within the Tartaria narrative, he is recast as a man who glimpsed or rediscovered principles once used on a large scale. A man whose ideas threatened a world economy built on controlled scarcity. Here, familiar names enter: Rockefeller, Morgan, Edison. Industrialists with investments in fuel and wires. The Illuminati, a convenient container for the idea of an elite network guarding certain secrets. Patents that describe unusual devices filed in the late 1800s gather dust. Some believers say were quietly classified under national security, not because they were dangerous weapons, but because they hinted at self-sustaining power. Crystals join the picture. Quartz and other minerals can convert pressure to electricity and back. At small scales, this is standard physics. Scaled up with arrays aligned to planetary fields, theorists imagine power grids that hum without smoke. In remote places near alleged Tartarian sites, there are large quartz deposits. In Siberia, for example, around the region where the Tunguska explosion in 1908 flattened forests. Mainstream science calls that an atmospheric meteor burst. Fringe thought asks whether a malfunctioning crystal array, a piece of old tech misaligned, might release energy in a similar way. Back on the surface, the star forts become not just defensive works, but nodes in a network. Cathedrals with their spires and domes become more than churches. They are resonant receivers and transmitters. Inside them, choirs sing. The sound rises, vibrates in air and stone. People report altered states. Peace-awe, sometimes something close to trance. Acousticians measure complex standing waves. Archaeoacoustic studies at places like Malta's hypogeum show how certain frequencies can shift brain states. From there, the theory stretches. What if these spaces were originally tuned not only for worship, but for energy work, for healing, levitation, communication? And if such a system once existed, airships gliding between energy nodes, crystals capturing atmospheric charge, buildings humming with useful resonance, then a world chained to coal and oil would indeed look like a step down, an intentional one. Reset not just of population and borders, but of technology itself. Downshifting from abundance to managed scarcity. A world in which power, literal and figurative, is something you must always pay for. If there was a time when Tartarian grandeur still stood in the open, something like the 19th century World's Fairs would have been the perfect stage to both display it and erase it. Take Chicago, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition. The White City. Photographs show a dreamscape, over 200 buildings across 600 acres. Classical facades gleaming under electric light reflected in artificial lagoons. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building alone was said to span 44 acres, large enough promoters boasted to swallow the U.S. Capitol, the Great Pyramid, and several cathedrals inside it with space to spare. Officially, it was all temporary. The fair's designers, led by architect Daniel Burnham, used a material called staff, a mix of plaster cement and fiber, over wood frames to create the illusion of marble. The buildings we're told were never meant to last, built in roughly 2 years, torn down or burned within a few more. Yet in the photographs, details look stubbornly permanent, intricate ironwork glass, stone-like textures. Sky-high domes, bridges and colonnades with the same language of form found in Tartarian structures elsewhere. Builders were largely local laborers and recent immigrants, many with no experience in such grand work. Chicago itself had been devastated by the fire of 1871, only 2 decades earlier. To those who adhere to the standard narrative, this is simply an example of what a focused burst of money manpower and willpower can do, especially under the demands of national pride. To Tartaria theorists, the timeline feels impossible. They propose a different story. The White City was not conjured from mud in 24 months. It was the cleaned-up shell of something older. An inherited complex, perhaps damaged by fire and flood, refurbished just enough to host a fair, then ceremonially destroyed. Show the public the old world one last time. Photograph it exhaustively, then erase it. Variations of this story attach themselves to other expositions. St. Louis, 1904, cascading lagoons and palaces. San Francisco, 1915, the Panama Pacific Exposition rising from the ruins of the 1906 earthquake, only to see most of its splendor demolished after. In each case, grand buildings labeled temporary, even as their form and mass seem anything but. In each case, only a few fragments survive, like San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, left standing as a museum piece while its siblings vanish. Official explanations stress cost, maintenance, changing uses of land. Staff structures crumble, fire hazards, urban development. The conspiratorial eye notices other details. Photos where streets in the fairgrounds look uncanny in their emptiness, as if the exposure time should have captured more bodies, angles missing from construction archives. A relentless pattern of build display burn occurring just as electric light and new building codes were changing cities forever. Add in the presence documented or rumored of Freemasons and similar fraternities among key planners. Ceremonies with symbolic overtones. Obelisks, domes, geometric alignments. And the fairs become in this retelling not just celebrations of progress, but funerals. Carefully choreographed goodbyes to the last above-ground remnants of a different order. Beyond expos and architecture, the 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by disaster stacked upon disaster. Fires, earthquakes, explosions, pandemics, wars. Taken as separate incidents, they fit into the normal turbulence of history. Taken as parts of a single pattern, they begin to look like stages of a reset. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Officially sparked by a lantern in a barn, fanned by wind, racing through wooden buildings. It burned roughly 3 square miles of the city. In its wake, ornate districts were gone. Simpler structures sometimes survived. Post-fire excavations turned up melted stone, and glass fused as if by temperatures beyond ordinary conflagrations. To some hints of unusual energies, plasma discharges from the sky, not just flame from below. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, a magnitude 7.9 rupture on the San Andreas Fault, followed by fires that consumed much of what remained. Yet, among the rubble workers reported intact facades and buried levels that seemed to predate the visible city, as if portions had been entombed earlier and only then exposed. Officially geology and bad luck, fault lines and wooden buildings. In the mud flood frame, perhaps something more targeted. Resonant frequencies triggered along faults. Soil liquefaction amplified. Defensive grids misfiring. Move northeast Tunguska, Siberia, 1908. An explosion in the sky flattens some 800 square miles of forest. Trees lie pointing away from a central point. No crater. The usual explanation, an airburst of a small comet or asteroid. In Tartarian lore, this is deeper. Siberia sits in the heartland of old Grand Tartary on those earlier maps. Tunguska might have been a final blow, an energy device overloading or being destroyed. One more strike in a campaign to neutralize old technology. Layer on to these physical shocks the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919. a virus that kills tens of millions, particularly of working-age adults. From the conventional angle, a tragic natural outbreak spread rapidly by crowded troop movements at the end of World War I. From the reset-minded angle, a biological culling, a way to reshape demographics, perhaps thinning out populations who still held on to memories or bloodlines linked to that older order. Even the two world wars can be drawn into this web. Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki cities turned to firestorms and shadows. Ancient quarters obliterated along with modern ones. Under cover of military necessity, opportunities to destroy any lingering anomalous structures and dig beneath them without attracting undue notice. Each piece has a sober mainstream explanation. Urban fires happen. Faults slip. Space rocks fall. Viruses mutate. Politics harden into war. But when all of them are overlaid on the map of Tartaria's supposed territories and time frame for those inclined to see it, they resolve into a method wipe, bury, rebuild, and ensure that what rises looks firmly modern. The mud flood in this reading is the core. Liquefied ground in the mid-1800s that turns lower stories into tombs. The disasters afterward are the cleanup crew. Plasma in the sky to vitrify and burn. Earthquakes to crack. Wars and pandemics to shuffle populations and loyalties. None of this can be proved. All of it can be dismissed. And yet the sensation that repeats is not certainty. It is unease. Step away from Tartaria for a moment, and the landscape is still crowded with other lost worlds. Mu, Lemuria, Atlantis, different names for missing continents, different versions of the story in which a mother civilization sits at the root of later branches only to be erased by water and fire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, occult writers like James Churchward claim to have read ancient tablets from India describing Mu, a vast Pacific land, stretching from Easter Island toward the Marianas, home to a gentle telepathic people who used crystals and pyramids to harness energy. Helena Blavatsky and later theosophists reimagined Lemuria in the Indian Ocean as a cradle of root races. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, spoke in trances about both Mu and Atlantis, placing their destruction tens of thousands of years in the past, with survivors fleeing to Egypt, Peru, the Gobi Desert. Plato much earlier told a story supposedly passed from Egyptian priests to Solon about Atlantis, a proud naval power beyond the pillars of Heracles, suspiciously advanced, brought low by earthquakes and floods when its arrogance offended the gods. Mainstream scholarship is blunt. There is no geological support for a single giant sunken continent in the Pacific or Indian Oceans. Plate tectonics does not work that way. Churchward's tablets have never been produced. Lemuria began as a biological hypothesis that was later abandoned. Cayce's visions are not evidence. Still, the motifs echo. Advanced harmony, crystal technology, telepathy, a fall through hubris, survivors scattering. To many, this feels like a preface. Mu as a mother, Atlantis as an Atlantic child, Tartaria as a later land-based heir, a chain of civilizations linked less by literal geography than by patterns reverence for geometry, use of resonance, catastrophic endings, suppression of memory. Crop circles enter here too, Those intricate formations pressed into fields overnight, circles, spirals, fractals, sometimes eerily similar to star fort layouts or mandalas. Debunkers have demonstrated how boards and ropes can make many of them. Yet in certain well-documented cases, there are details bent but unbroken stalks, microscopic changes at nodes, electromagnetic anomalies that are harder to wave away. Within this mythic framework, crop circles become messages from descendants of those older cultures, Mu Atlantis, Tartaria, or from the same extraterrestrial allies who supposedly once taught them. Geometric postcards saying, "Remember." In Wiltshire circles mimic ringed city plans reminiscent of Plato's Atlantis. In Siberia, patterns appear near megalithic sites, suggesting a link to something even deeper. Romanian Tartaria tablets, small clay pieces with strange markings dated to around 5300 BCE spark, yet another association, if only by name. Mainstream archaeologists see them as, early symbols, maybe proto-writing. Enthusiasts see the word Tartaria itself as a linguistic bridge back to something very old. In this web, timelines slip. Mu 50,000 years ago, Atlantis 12,000, Tartaria in the 19th century. New chronologies compress them. Alternative thinkers suggest pole shifts that scramble not just geography, but memory-blending events. From outside, it looks like a tangle of wishful thinking. From inside, it looks like a mosaic, broken pieces of one long, repeating story. Golden ages of subtle technology, catastrophes, survivors, rebuilds with less than before. Into this swirl of maps and myths enters a much older pair of names, Gog and Magog. In the Bible, they appear as ominous figures in end-time visions. In Ezekiel, Gog is a prince from the far north, leading a coalition of nations, Meshech Tubal, against Israel in a final onslaught. Fire from heaven destroys his armies. In the book of Revelation, Gog and Magog are multitudes deceived by Satan after 1,000 years of peace gathering from the ends of the earth to surround the camp of the saints, only to be consumed by divine fire. In Islamic tradition, in the Quran story of Du al-Qarnayn, often linked to Alexander the Great, Yajuj and Majuj, Gog and Magog are chaotic tribes confined behind a barrier of iron and copper, destined to break out near the end. Medieval European maps sometimes place Gog and Magog in the far northeast, in wild Asian lands beyond the civilized world. The 1375 Catalan Atlas shows them penned behind a wall. Later charts from the 17th century even label regions within Great Tartary as Gog and Magog near the Caspian and Black Seas. To certain modern eyes, this convergence is too tempting to ignore. Perhaps they say Tartaria itself was the land of Gog and Magog, a northern empire, later demonized by biblical and medieval imaginations. Or perhaps Gog and Magog were not the Tartarians, but the forces that ultimately breached their defenses. In some conspiratorial readings, Tartaria is even recast as the Millennial Kingdom, a Christianized golden age on Earth, later overthrown by the hordes of Gog and Magog, which arrive not on horseback, but through portals. Stargates. Stories sprout around ancient ziggurats and stone carvings. In Iraq, rumors during the early 2000s claimed that Saddam Hussein had found a portal device beneath the ziggurat at Ur, something linked to the Anunnaki of Sumerian myth, prompting secret geopolitical moves to control it. In Sri Lanka, carvings at Ranmasu Uyana a rock panel with concentric designs, are interpreted by some as a star map or gate key. In Siberia, Tartaria's old cartographic heartland, reports of UFOs over Lake Baikal and remote forests add a modern layer. Spheres of light, metallic discs, hums in the sky. Incidents like the 1986 Dalnogorsk crash, where a strange object fell and left unusual traces. Fold these into a biblical framework and a picture forms. Gog and Magog, as not merely human tribes, but non-human intelligences, demons, aliens, or something between the two, breaking through dimensional rifts in the north. Tartaria as either their stronghold or their target. Portals as both weapons and wounds. Even the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics opening ceremony has been pulled into this narrative. Held on the Black Sea coast near regions once mapped as Tartary, the ceremony included floating transforming structures and a famous glitch in the 5 Olympic rings one segment that failed to open on cue. To most, an embarrassing technical error. To others, a symbolic broken portal. Sections depicting Russia's history, from pastoral scenes to industrial storm, are watched frame by frame for hidden gestures, a harmonious world threatened by shadows from above. In this layering, Sochi becomes not just a sports event, but an occult pageant, either revealing or mocking Tartaria's fall to Gog and Magog. Whether you see that as insight or imaginative overreach, often depends less on the evidence and more on your appetite for intertwining ancient prophecy with modern spectacle. But even here, below the demons and aliens, the same pattern hums. A great order, an invasion, literal or metaphorical. A breach, a fire. If an empire was truly reset by mud, by war, by plasma, by portals, its structures would not be the only things that needed rearranging. People would. In the mid-1800s, across the United States, a strange social experiment unfolded the orphan trains. From roughly 1854 to 1929, organizations like the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital put an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children on trains heading west and south from crowded eastern cities. Some were truly orphaned. Others had living parents too poor to keep them. Many records are patchy. At each stop along the line, local families would gather at depots. Children would be lined up, inspected, chosen, taken home as adoptees, foster labor, or something in between. Some found loving homes. Others were treated little better than indentured servants. At the time, this was praised by many as humanitarian, a way to relieve urban squalor and give children fresh air and opportunity. Critics even then saw something darker auctions in all but name. In the Tartaria, retelling a further question is added. Why this scale? Why this timing? If in the mid-19th century, vast tracts of land, including regions supposedly rich with Tartarian architecture, had been emptied by disaster, there would be a need to repopulate. To bring in new generations without the memories, loyalties, or bloodlines of the old. The orphan trains become, in that story, not just charity, but logistics. Children, plastic, malleable, without documented pasts, distributed into territories where strange old buildings now stood half-buried, raised among new narratives, taught to see any remaining anomalies as quaint, not threatening. Fraternal orders slide quietly into this picture. The independent order of Oddfellows publicly committed to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan spread lodges and orphanages across America in the same era. Their halls often occupy imposing buildings whose facades resemble the same neoclassical Tartarian style. Their rituals, like those of Freemasons, involve symbols, skeletons dramatized moral lessons. Freemasons themselves, with squares and compasses carved into keystones, lay cornerstones of courthouses, capitals, museums. Their imagery appears on banknotes and in city plans. Within the conspiracy narrative, these fraternities are not harmless clubs. They are custodians of the reset. They run the trains. They manage the foundling hospitals. They decide where the children go. They oversee which stories are told and which are quietly dropped. Even the Cabbage Patch Baby image folktales of babies found in gardens and later literal incubator exhibits at fairs displaying premature infants in glass cases as educational curiosities gains a speculative edge. Perhaps some whisper there were not enough surviving children. Perhaps technologies existed to accelerate or augment birth-crude echoes of Tartarian biotech. The incubators that saved lives may have been glimpses of something more industrial, a way to refill the world. Beyond America, similar patterns appear. British home children shipped to Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. Children from overcrowded orphanages sent to farmsteads abroad, often with minimal supervision. Always the story is framed as rescue and opportunity. Always the deeper record is mixed. In each case, there is a movement of the youngest, least documented people to the most open, least historically rooted lands. In a purely social lens, this is about poverty, empire, and labor. In a Tartarian lens, it is also about memory. Ensure that those who grow up among the leftovers of an older order have no way to remember what came before. At some point in this maze of maps, mud giants, airships, fairs, resets, lost continents, portals, orphans, and orders, another kind of question usually arrives. Not, is this true in an absolute sense? But what does it do to us to think this way? On one side stand debunkers. Historians point out that Tartary was a broad, imprecise label used by Europeans who did not yet know the political realities of Central Asia and Siberia. As Russian and Chinese states consolidated, more accurate terms replaced it. The word faded not by edict, but by obsolescence. Geologists note there is no sign of a single global mud event in the 1800s. What we see in buried buildings is a patchwork of local factors. Rivers flooding cities, raising street levels for sanitation fires, prompting reconstruction on top of rubble. Archaeologists remind us that newspaper reports of giants in the 19th century were often sensationalist, competing for attention in an age before strict fact-checking. Many discoveries trace back to hoaxes or misidentified bones. Institutions like the Smithsonian say plainly they have no 9-foot skeletons in their vaults. Engineers show photographs and blueprints of world's fairs being constructed in real time with scaffolding and workers. They explain staff as a cheap imitation stone and demolition as pragmatic, not sinister. Scholars critique Graham Hancock's work for overstating connections and understating uncertainties. They warn that attributing indigenous achievements to lost advanced outsiders echoes old colonial habits. Skeptical writers trace Tartaria memes back to specific sources: fringe Russian nationalism, compressed chronologies, online echo chambers. On the other side stand believers, or those who are at least Tartaria curious. They look at the uniformity of buried windows, the global spread of star-shaped forts, the striking consistency of a certain architectural style across supposedly separate cultures and time periods. They notice school curricula that skim lightly over Siberian and Central Asian histories. They see how quickly alternative views are sometimes dismissed, not with detailed engagement, but with ridicule. They point to patents sealed away, to whistleblowers hinting at classified craft, to the emotional intensity with which any talk of free energy is policed. They ask why, if all of this is obviously false, the fascination only seems to grow. Between these poles, many simply hover in the gray, knowing that pseudo-history can be dangerous, that it can slide into extremism, fuel fantasies of pure pasts stolen by corrupt others, and erode trust in any shared reality. But also sensing that official narratives have their own blind spots, that education systems do simplify, sanitize, omit, that there are indeed lost civilizations, not named in school books, overlooked cultures whose ruins sit off syllabus, that perhaps the deep appeal of Tartaria is less about a specific erased empire and more about a longing for a world where beauty, geometry, and meaning were more integrated with daily life, for technologies that felt less extractive, less loud, for a sense that we are heirs to more than 5,000 years of slow grind. In that longing, Tartaria becomes a symbol, a container for dissatisfactions with disposable modernity, a way to say we could be more without yet knowing how. The final turn in many of these stories is toward hope, toward the idea that even if Tartaria, as drawn on conspiracy maps, never existed, the questions it raises can still be useful. That star forts can inspire new ways of designing resilient, community-owned energy systems. That cathedral acoustics can point toward gentler sound technologies. That recognizing cycles of rise and fall can make us less arrogant about our current moment. And for those who lean all the way in there, is an even quieter hope that remnants of some older harmony, energetic, psychic, architectural, still linger in stone and story. That they can be retuned, not to rebuild an empire, but to help us avoid another reset. In the end, whether you see Tartaria as fraud, as fact, or as metaphor, the same invitation waits at the bottom of the spiral. To look a little closer at the built world around you. To notice what feels out of place. To ask why certain stories are told and others are not. To balance skepticism with wonder. To let the possibility that our past is stranger than we were taught make you not paranoid, but humble. If wandering through these possibilities helps you drift into sleep, or simply gives your mind a slower landscape to roam, that is its own kind of use. And if you feel called to keep exploring these long, looping mysteries, to sit with the questions rather than lunge for any final answer, then you are already walking the same quiet paths that gave birth to them. Wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is where you are, let the images settle, buried windows humming forts, vanished names on maps. Not as proofs, as reminders that beneath the surface of any story, official or forbidden, there is always more ground. Before sleep finally pulls you under, try this. Instead of thinking about Tartaria as a map label, or a theory thread, or a stack of old photographs, imagine it as a feeling. Not a place, a sensation. You're walking through your own city late at night. The crowds are gone. The glass and steel that feel so dominant in daylight have gone dark, their reflections flattened. What stands out instead are the older shapes. The stone bank with columns that don't quite match the scale of the people using the ATMs. The theater, whose entrance doors still stretch higher than any modern storefront. The municipal building with a staircase that always tires your legs faster than it should. You've seen them before. You've passed them 100 times without really noticing. But tonight, with all these stories about buried floors, vanished empires, and resets still echoing in your head, they look different. You find yourself wondering, not is Tartaria real in some hard historical sense, but who were these built for, and what did it feel like to be the first person to step through that doorway long before any of the stories we've been told were written down? As you walk, the ground itself starts to feel less certain. Every manhole cover, every grate, every slight slope in the pavement becomes a hint. What's under here? Is there an old street under this street? A buried doorway under this doorway? A forgotten window staring out into compacted earth a few meters below your feet? Officially, there are reasonable answers. Basements, utility tunnels, older foundations, sewer lines. But the mind late at night doesn't always want reasonable answers. It wants images. It conjures a lower city, brick arches, cobblestones, gaslight, now pressed into the role of basement or service corridor. It imagines a time when those arches were not underground at all, but open to sky. When what is lower now was simply the level where people lived. It lets the mud flood story slip in not as a proven event, but as a kind of lens. Not, this happened exactly like this, but what if the things we walk on are not as simple as we assume? The same shift happens with the world's fairs. Once they were a page in a school book, a trivia question. Where was the Ferris wheel introduced? Which fair had? Which pavilion? Now in this quieter space, they become almost dreamlike. The white city rising from swampland. Domes and columns reflected in artificial lagoons. Lights burning against the night, reflected in eyes that had never seen such concentrated brilliance. People flowed through those spaces for a season, then left. Photographs captured the facades. Architects took notes. Writers described the atmosphere as otherworldly. Then fire demolition dispersal. Walking through a modern park on land where one of those fairs once stood, it can be difficult to feel any of that. A path upon some trees, maybe a single building left repurposed, maybe a plaque. But with Tartaria in mind, that blankness acquires a different texture. Not just this was here, now it's gone, but this was something we decided not to carry forward. Whether or not you believe that the halls were Tartarian relics, or that the timeline of their construction hides deeper mysteries, it's hard to escape one fact. There was for a brief moment a built world of improbable beauty, and we chose not to keep it. We could have preserved more of those buildings. We didn't. We could have let the White City become a permanent neighborhood. We didn't. A reset doesn't have to be cosmic to be real. Sometimes it is as simple as a group of people deciding that a certain way of building, a certain way of arranging space belongs to a closed chapter. The mudflood hypothesis pushes that idea further, suggesting not just architectural preferences changing, but entire layers of the past being literally submerged and repaved. Even if you never fully accept that narrative, the questions it raises linger. How much of what you think of as the city is just the most recent skin? How many decisions about what to save and what to burn were made long before you were born by people whose names you'll never know? And if there were resets, large or small, natural or engineered, how would you recognize them from inside? The orphan trains, the foundling homes, the the children lined up in front of strangers at rural stations. Those at least are not hypothetical. They happened. Whether they were primarily charity, primarily labor supply, or something more orchestrated, they show one piece of any reset clearly. To change the future, you don't always have to change buildings first. You change who grows up in them. You change who remembers. Those children scattered into new families and new landscapes would have grown up with no personal memories of any older order. For them, the strange old courthouse on the hill, the oversized opera house downtown, the star-shaped fort on the outskirts, would simply be the way things have always looked. The idea that those structures might be leftovers from something earlier would not even need to be suppressed. It simply wouldn't occur to most people to ask. That is the part of all of this that feels hardest to shake long after specific theories fade. Not the idea that there was one hidden empire called Tartaria, perfectly coherent and then perfectly erased, but the realization that forgetting is easy, that it doesn't always require censorship or giant conspiracies or global floods of mud. Most of the time, it only needs time distraction and a few decisive choices about what gets kept in the open and what gets left to crumble quietly under new foundations. The rest our minds do on their own. They adapt. They say, this is normal to whatever is in front of us, no matter how strange it might have looked to someone a few generations back. The Tartaria story, in all its tangled forms, pushes against that adaptation. It invites you not to believe every claim, not to swap one unquestioned narrative for another, but to let a little slowness back into the way you look at the built world. To notice when a window is half underground. To wonder why a door is too tall. To pause in a resonant hall and listen longer than the architect ever expected. It also invites a different kind of humility. Because whether the mud flood was global or local, whether the maps of Tartaria mark a real lost empire, or just the edge of old European knowledge, one thing is clear: our picture of the past is partial. There are cultures we only know through a handful of artifacts, cities we've barely begun to excavate, oral histories we ignored until they were almost gone. In that sense, everyone lives in a kind of reset, born into a world already edited, given stories that explain some things, leave out others, and rarely admit how much they don't know. Lying in the dark, listening to tales about Tartaria and mudfloods and giants and world's fairs and orphans and resets. You are not being asked to pick a side between true and false in any final way. You are being given permission to hold the question, to let the possibility that our foundations are stranger than we think sit next to the knowledge that some ideas really are illusions. To sleep not with the comfort of certainty, but with a quieter, older comfort that curiosity itself is a kind of protection. As long as some part of you keeps asking, what's under this street? As long as some part of you feels that tug in the gut when a story seems too neat, the ground may shift, but you will not be entirely caught off guard. So, tonight as you drift off, let the image settle. A city layered in time, a building half buried, a forgotten map with a name smeared across the top of the world. Not proof, just a reminder that beneath whatever layer you wake up on tomorrow, there are always others. And that sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a world of fast explanations is exactly what you are doing now, lying still, listening long, letting the questions breathe.